Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Wednesday. It's March 26th, 2025. Today is day 537 since October 7th of 2023. Greetings. I'm now in Abu Dhabi. I'm on the Arab Peninsula. A lot said about the United Arab Emirates, particularly about its political engagement in the Middle East and whether or not its allegiances to Israel or to Palestinians. It's often criticized because of its normalization deal. Things are said about its peace building efforts, whether or not normalization between the UAE and Israel is a good thing. My understanding is that the vast majority of critics of the normalization deal are not opposing countries forming economic ties with Israel on principle, but rather that the UAE didn't hold any standards related to the Palestinian people prior to signing that agreement. I'll talk a bit about why that's important. But I believe, in fact, in the normalization agreement, that there was a line that talked about annexation, saying that it should at least be put on hold temporarily. And then there was a question about if it was translated correctly in English versus Arabic. This was a big deal when all that was happening in 2020. But if you know anything about what's happening in the occupied West Bank, annexation's happening de facto, if not outright. It's been stated by Israeli politicians that it's all but been declared legally official. And of course, there are attempts in the Knesset to officially annex different parts of the East Jerusalem settlements, etc. In other words, the UAE threw their Palestinian siblings under the bus by not demanding that Israel end the occupation prior to signing a normalization deal. And that was all before October 7th of 2023. You should know that's hugely significant and relevant to the issues we're talking about today for two reasons. One, Saudi Arabia right now is in the exact same position. It is very, very high on the priority list for President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu for Israel and Saudi Arabia to sign a normalization deal. Israel and Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia thus far at least has taken a different approach than the UAE. They've said we're not going to do so until everything with Gaza is settled, essentially a permanent ceasefire. And then there was also a conversation, at least behind the scenes, where it was alluded to the fact that maybe Saudi Arabia agreed to a swap where they would say if Israel doesn't annex the West Bank, they would have a normalization deal. That just came out in the last week. And Saudi Arabia said that absolutely is not true. We are not going to exchange normalization for a stay on annexation. So it's really, really relevant. The whole history I just gave you of the UAE and normalization is really relevant to this moment today. The second reason you should know about the history of the UAE and normalization is that the foundations of the Arab Peace Initiative presented in March 2002 in Beirut. It was based on the idea that Israel could become the economic hub of the Middle East. If the occupation and human rights abuses towards Palestinians were brought to an end, if there was this comprehensive two-state agreement, then that whole economic piece was a critical component of the Arab Peace Initiative. Thus, in 2020, when four nations signed normalization deals, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, that took away much needed leverage from these other states on what it would take to make peace with Palestinians. Some would say the potential of the Saudi Arabian normalization deal with Israel was one of the main reasons behind the timing of the October 7th attacks. So what's happened in the last 24 hours in the Middle East? Might we use this information as knowledge for prayer to grow our hearts and minds as we seek to discern how God might have us respond and work together towards a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire and towards peace? An update on the U.S. data security breach about the U.S. attacks on Yemen a couple of weeks ago. Democratic members of Congress caused quite a fuss last night and were calling for, severe responses. The senior administration officials' unprecedented use of signal to discuss sensitive military information was, quote, not a serious glitch, end quote. And the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, has, quote, learned a lesson, end quote. That's what President Trump told NBC News. Waltz says he takes full responsibility for including Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic in the chat, while denying knowing Goldberg and accusing the publication of spreading falsehoods on other topics. Just today, The Atlantic published more of those direct communications. So that whole saga is continuing. In Syria, the U.S. gave Syria a list of conditions to fulfill in order to obtain partial sanctions relief, calling for, among other things, Damascus's destruction of any remaining chemical weapons stores, cooperation on counterterrorism, and not installing foreign fighters in senior roles. And then shifting towards Gaza and the Israel-Hamas war, hundreds of Palestinians yesterday, this is really significant news, protested against Hamas in Gaza in a rare show of overt dissent against the militant group's presence in the territory. I have said before, I've gone into Gaza, I think 3 times now, maybe 4. When I have spent time in Gaza, people don't first talk about the injustices of the occupation. They first talk about the injustices of Hamas. And that's something that I've heard regularly. So there's now overt and public protesting, which is less common. Khalil Sayah, who's a Palestinian Christian from Gaza, educated by the Bethlehem Bible College, someone we've been getting to know at Churches for Middle East Peace. He spoke at our summit just last week. He posted on X, and by the way, the context is his father and sister were killed in the last year. I believe by Israeli bombings, but certainly by Israeli attacks in the past 16 months. Sayah posted about the protests in the north of Gaza demanding to end wars. And he said that you can see a sign that says enough wars, and another says our children's blood is not cheap. The protesters want to send a strong message to Hamas, who they view as being careless about their lives. Israeli airstrikes killed Al Jazeera reporter Hossam Shabat and Palestinian Today journalist Mohammed Mansour in Gaza this week. A committee to protect journalists reported. An Israeli military previously accused Shabat of being a member of Hamas, an allegation the CPG condemned as a smear campaign. Israel's move of detainees away from the Taman Detention Center has not corrected alleged abuses against Palestinian detainees, according to Israeli human rights organizations who say that the conditions in the new camps are just as bad. The Islamic Jihad organization in Gaza took responsibility for 2 rockets that were fired into Israel. One hit was identified in an open area near a Gaza border community. And the IDF issued an evacuation notice to residents of neighborhoods in Gaza City, saying the terrorist organizations are once again firing rockets from within civilian areas. Netanyahu said at a hearing at the Knesset that the more Hamas persists in its refusal to release hostages, the more powerful pressure will be against them, including seizing the territory. And anti-government protesters in Israel blocked central highways near Jerusalem, hundreds participating in academic protests as well in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. The IDF announced the findings of a probe into the Nova Music Festival massacre and will present those to the families of the victims and hostages from the festival, as well as to survivors next week. And Houthi rebels said overnight into today that they attacked U.S. aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman, currently deployed into the Red Sea. I mean, that's the 4th or 5th time this has happened with the Harry Truman in the last week or two. The U.S. military said it conducted dozens of strikes in Yemen, according to Al Jazeera. The Financial Times reported that Israel's military has drawn up plans to reconquer Gaza in a bid to finally defeat Hamas. This would pave the way for a long-running occupation of the besieged enclave. They're talking about occupation in terms of physically being inside the enclave. The proposal has not been approved by the Security Cabinet yet. It's formulated by the new IDF Chief of Staff, who has longed for drastically harsher tactics to fight the militant group. I've talked about the phases that have happened, the 4 phases that have been implemented. 2 officials have talked about these plans, and they're saying that it's been made possible by President Trump, which freed up Israel to do what it needed to do. The prior administration wanted to end the war, and Trump wants Israel to win the war. According to the plan, the IDF would call up several combat divisions, would reinvade to subdue Hamas, would take control of wide swaths of the enclave, and force the 2 million plus people into a small, so-called humanitarian zone along the Mediterranean coast. Israel's military would administer Gaza, including administering the distribution of aid. We know that that means a significant limitation in the distribution of aid. They would reoccupy the territory after 20 years of having pulled out. Israel's occupied the enclave for nearly 4 decades until 2005 after capturing it in 1967. This would uproot millions of Palestinians. It would corral them into an even smaller patch of land. I mean, this idea is just so digressive and so horrific. It's hard to imagine. One of the people familiar with the deliberations was talking about these specifics and said that not only would aid, be distributed by the Israeli military, it could be distributed through private contractors. Smotrich, the influential far-right finance minister, said Israeli soldiers should prepare for a battle to finish the job, that Gaza won't be the same Gaza that we've come to know in the past decades. And from what we've seen the last week and, recently, this plan is well on its way to being implemented. I wanted to close by letting you know I spent some time today with some local religious leaders at the Abrahamic Family House, and I hadn't known the details of what that project was. I'd heard about it, and it was really, really inspiring in so many ways. It's a facility that includes 3 separate worship spaces, a synagogue, a church, a mosque. It does not seek to promote syncretism in any way, but mutual respect across religious differences. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim worship communities have their own respective spaces, but also the opportunity to learn about different Abrahamic religions. 99% of the people who go through the doors of the Abrahamic Family House have never stepped foot in a religious worship center that is not of their own tradition. And I found that really inspiring. I met today with the rabbi and also with the priest. It's a Catholic worship center, but is very open to Protestants and others worshiping there as well. And to me, it was an exemplification of learning how to walk hand in hand without seeing eye to eye. And my encouragement to us is let's learn how to do that while collectively speaking out boldly against ending the killing of the people of Gaza and the children in Gaza, and calling for the release of the hostages and demanding a solution to ending the occupation of the Palestinian people, and addressing the long-term security needs of Israel, which are legitimate. And I'm not talking about a zero-sum game. I'm not falsely equivocating. But might we pursue a peace where all could live in freedom, self-determination, with justice and peace and security? And might those of us who worship the Prince of Peace, Jesus, pray in his name, in the name of Christ. Amen.